Hello, everybody, and welcome to Friday Fix. I'm Doc NYC's Artistic Director, Tom Powers. On this episode, we're going to cover 3 projects. My first guest will be Jihan Robinson, the head of documentary at the new platform Quibi. Our second segment will focus on the documentary And She Could Be Next, about women of color running for political office in 2018. That 2-part project is coming to public television's POV series next week. Ava DuVernay signed on as an executive producer, and I'll be talking to the 2 directors, Grace Lee and Marjan Safinia. My final guest will be the Oscar-nominated director, David France. His new film is Welcome to Chechnya, that premiered at Sundance and will be released next week on HBO. The film focuses on the Russian Republic of Chechnya, where the government conducts a violent campaign of hate against its LGBTQ citizens. The film follows a group of activists who operate a modern-day underground railroad to help victims escape into exile. Let me get started with our first segment on Quibi. The streaming site is led by Jeffrey Katzenberg and Meg Whitman, and they designed it to deliver short episodic content. The company had tremendous momentum at the start of the year. They even had Super Bowl commercials, but nothing could have prepared them for their launch date in early April, just a few weeks after COVID-19 had turned the world upside down. The platform has managed to persevere and continues to put out really impressive documentary work. A few weeks ago, we featured director Mark Levin talking about his Quibi series with LeBron James called I Promise, about the first year of a new public school in Ohio. Another recent Quibi doc is called Blackballed. It looks at a racist scandal that rocked the National Basketball Association in 2014. I'm gonna just show you a trailer right now for Blackballed.
Whole team that's black that plays for you.
Just do I know? The Clippers burdened by ignorant, racist comments made by its owner. I support that and give them food.
When I listened to it, I had to listen to it again because I was like, man, he didn't just say that.
If you don't stand for something, then you're part of the problem.
Who gives it to them? Does someone else give it to them? Who makes the game? Do I make the game or do they make the game?
Each generation is faced with the issues of their times.
Seeing CNN and Fox News and realizing this was much bigger than anything I had ever faced before.
Social injustice is bigger than basketball. It's bigger than anything.
Words hurt. I was always taught to fight.
I want the story back.
The NBA is in trouble because you heard the dreaded B word, boycott.
This is big news. That was it, though. That was the beginning of the fight.
We had this new generation of athletes saying we stand in the tradition of people like Muhammad Ali, like Tommy Smith, like John Carlos. This history matters.
There was so much going on. Basketball was like one of the last things on any of our minds.
Hell, we don't play for him anyway. We play for each other.
Oh, I got it!
A effective immediately. I am banning Mr. Sterling for life.
Now let's bring on Jihan Robinson, the head of documentary at Quibi. Hi, Jihan.
There I am. Hi, how are you, Tom?
Good, thank you. Thank you for being here. Yeah, I want to acknowledge the audience that you were my student for a semester many years ago when I taught documentary production at New York University's School of Continuing Professional Studies. And I gotta say, I had several hundred students go through that class, but you were definitely a standout in the real curiosity and intensity that you had about getting into the documentary field. And it's just been a real pleasure to watch your career evolve from there.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, very influential, great mentor, and someone I admire. So I'm really happy to be here today with you, Tom.
So let me ask you, when Quibi came to you to run a documentary department, what were they looking for?
Well, you know, I was admittedly a bit skeptical when I was approached by Quibi, but I had a conversation with Jeffrey, and you know, what really attracted me to it was that he was embarking on, and Quibi was embarking on, creating a new storytelling medium that was, you know, supposed to be optimized for the mobile device, where people were increasingly spending their time as their, you know, primary screen they were engaging with every day. And having worked in sort of traditional features and series television for a number of years, I was excited by the prospect of trying to crack a sort of a new way of seeing in documentary.
Let's talk about that show Blackballed that we just watched the trailer of. It feels like it's got extra resonance right now. Of course, it's been in the works for a long time. How did that project wind up at Quibi?
So that project came into the walls of Quibi with, you know, a great sort of sizzle reel and production materials, where it just resonated with me as an executive a lot, because it was a story that I think a lot of people were familiar with, but the approach to the storytelling wasn't going to be about the scandal per se, but really about the perspective of the players and sort of that trauma and dehumanization that comes with racism that's experienced by people of color, and also raised lots of questions around sort of race and power within professional sports, and sort of, you know, who makes the games a central question of the film that I thought was an important conversation to have, and really tell the story through the eyes of the people who are victimized versus the perpetrator, which often happens in these types of stories.
I mean, can you talk about the way you and the film team adapt a story like that specifically for the platform, or where you're, I forget how many episodes there are to telling that story?
Sure. So it was conceived as a feature film, you know, a traditional sort of 90-minute feature. It's 12 parts on Quibi. And, you know, each chapter can be up to 10 minutes. They can vary in length from 6 and 7, but it's really about what is helping to drive the story forward. So what's really key for a doc at Quibi is that it has a strong propulsive narrative at the center, which we had in sort of the seam of the story of the scandal. And then we had cultural commentators, journalists, thought leaders, speaking to the larger cultural themes that the story sort of represented. So it naturally fit the Quibi platform in a lot of ways, because we had a chronological story to track that we could then dip into these larger conversations.
Quibi came online 2 months ago. It's been a crazy 2 months in the world. Can you talk about how you're adapting to what you're learning about your audience, and and what you're working on now with documentaries?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, it's been business as usual for us, and I think what we've learned is people are highly engaged in documentary storytelling on the platform. And I think, you know, we certainly are in a golden age of documentary filmmaking, and that people are coming to find it on Quibi as well. And they are highly engaged in the stories that, you know, would be seen as traditional features, sort of longer form serialized storytelling, that they can track a singular story over multiple episodes in a big way. And so I think in terms of the way we're looking at programming for the future, sort of leaning into more of those types of sort of self-contained stories that you can tell over multiple parts. And, you know, the pandemic has been challenging, I think, for everybody in the filmmaking community, but we're working with incredible filmmakers that are actually back out in the field, are, you know, as we speak, conducting interviews, finding ways to, you know, socially distance and shoot. Which is really, you know, encouraging.
I mean, I'm curious, there's all these big things going on in the world with COVID-19, with protests in the street. You know, as an executive, how do you react to people, you know, pitching stories that must be coming in clusters to you about, you know, what's happening last week?
Right. I mean, it's challenging, right? Because it's, the news cycle is so quick, things change every day, that I think it just comes down to the basics of why people make documentaries to begin with. What's a great story that's well told? And for us, it's really going to be about what is something that's going to feel emotional, character driven, and, you know, an opportunity for people to grow and gain some emotional empathy through, you know, this storytelling. But I will say that there are so many of these stories being made right now that, you know, it's hard to sort of dissect what is sort of going to rise to the top in terms of storytelling. So we're just sort of leaning back right now and sort of leaning into more things that could be sort of counter programming to the sort of active moment, and be a place where people can find great entertainment. And so that's sort of where we're leaning right now.
Let me ask you about one of the other shows on Quibi that I think is a real standout, called Run This City. Can you tell the audience about that project?
Sure. That came to us by a great young filmmaker named Brent Hodge. It's a story of the youngest mayor in America. Well, he was at 23, who, you know, against all odds, beat the local, you know, players to become the mayor of the city. And he's charismatic, he is young, and sort of pisses off the people in the town because they don't feel like that he has the experience to be there. And so when he gets into office, he's indicted on 9 counts of wire fraud for, you know, behavior that he was engaged with before he became mayor. And we track that story and the small town politics around it. And it's sort of a, you know, do you trust him or do you not trust him kind of story, but is a real sort of parable for our modern day politics without necessarily having to focus on our modern day politics, but extremely cinematic and a really fun story.
There's a question that came in from the director, Kahani Cooperman, who is asking if you're finding viewers like watching these stories to completion. I don't know how much you can talk about data, but can you give it any anecdotal impressions about, you know, how your users are using the platform?
Yes, the short answer is yes. There is very high engagement and retention in documentaries. People are sticking around and making sure that they get every bite until the last one.
Right. You know, there's a big scrutiny going on in our industry right now about who holds power. I've heard Stanley Nelson talk about when he walks in to pitch to funders, it's usually a room full of white executives. And I want to ask about how this industry looks from your perspective. You used to be a producer walking in rooms pitching. You know, since then you've been in as an executive in you know, a very white field. You know, what has that been like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. I mean, you know, it never feels great to be the only one in a room, right? And I am extremely, I feel extremely blessed to be accepted by this community, to be working. It's based on a lot of luck and opportunity, but also a lot of hard work. And I think, I find it as my role as an executive is sort of to help bring more people in, bring the next generation in, because I was lucky to sort of cross paths first at, IFP and Cinetic and, HBO and all of these places where I was able to create a really robust network of people taking your class, where we met for the first time, that I have sort of traveled with me as I've been able to grow in my career, who've been incredible allies. And I want to create sort of that deeper network with other people who are looking to get into the industry, and also encourage people. I approached documentary wanting to be a producer, but given my circumstances, I went to grad school, I had a ton of student loan debt, I couldn't necessarily take the independent filmmaker path because I had debt. And so I ended up on an executive track, reluctantly thinking I wouldn't be able to be creative in my job, and my job is incredibly creative. And so it's also, I think, about the next generation of folks that are coming up in the creative community thinking, if you're a great producer, maybe you'll make a great executive. Maybe if you think you're a great director, maybe you'll be a great executive. That there's not only one pathway in the documentary industry, and that one on the executive side can be one that's really robust and interesting.
Before I let you go, there was a question from Cora Atkinson asking about when does Quibi come in on a project? Can you elaborate on that?
At all stages, we are, providing development funding, and we also are also considering acquiring completed films and, reversioning them for our platform now. So really at any stage.
All right. Well, I hope that people who are watching will check out the platform, because they're, the Blackballed series, I Promise, Run the City, and there's a lot more where that came from. You're working with some really great documentary talent. So thank you very much, Jihan, for joining us today.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Before I bring on our next guest, I will just talk a little bit about this segment. We're going to be talking about And She Could Be Next. This is a two-part project coming to POV next week to kick off their summer season. In 2018, the filmmakers followed several women of color running for political office all over the country. The subjects of their film include Detroit's Rashida Tlaib, who was running for Congress, and Georgia's Stacey Abrams, who was running for governor. Before I bring in the directors, let me show the trailer to that.
In the history of this country, any guesses out of 11,000 people that have served in the United States Congress, how many women of color have served?
There is this assumption that Black people don't vote, that Latinos are not American citizens, that Asian Americans are Republicans, and that young people are wholly unreliable. I want you to understand that who I am is a product of a movement. There are not enough people on the inside that look like me.
People aspiring to be leaders in this country, they need to go through women of color, because we're making our voices known.
When I say I'm a social justice seeker, I'm a mama for justice, or all these things, that's where I'm saying I'm American. I don't need to say it. I act like an American.
Candidates do not normally talk to people in the Asian American community because, historically speaking, we are the community that turns out to vote at the lowest rate. So we want to change that here today.
Các cô kia cô không có ở nhà, bác gái cô không đi bầu không với con không dẫn đi bây giờ luôn.
we're no longer asking for permission to do what we need to do. We're going to do it, and we're going to lead from the top, and people need to see it.
The sort of traditional notions of what's possible in American politics are being challenged every day. Elections are important, but our lives are on the line. Elections are
Sisters and brothers, it's about building power in our community to win what is right.
Except the communities that need to be brought in reflect the new American majority. They're young, they're brown, they might speak another language, and there's a lot of us. I'm excited about the fact that women of color are now coming into our own, that we're standing up and taking our rightful place in the pantheon of leadership, that we're changing what the face of leadership looks like.
It is a new day, there's a new coalition, and ultimately we're going to push this country forward because there's more of us than those that seek to do us harm.
All right, as bring in our guests, I'm going to flashback to 2013 when Grace Lee was a guest at Doc NYC with her film American Revolutionary, The Evolution of Grace Lee Boggs. And that was a really special moment for me at Doc NYC to have Grace Lee Boggs there, the grassroots organizer from Detroit, my hometown. In fact, my classmate's family sold Grace Lee Boggs her house. So I want to thank you again, Grace Lee, for that opportunity. Can I ask you guys how you got started on And She Could Be Next? At what point did you realize that this was a story, a phenomenon of these women for running for office, and what were you trying to do?
I can, a little bit of a backstory. We both Marjan and I are political junkies, and I always say that I've always been interested in politics, but politicians not so much. Several years ago, back in 2013, I actually met Rashida Tlaib when she was a state rep in Michigan, when I was making this Makers series for PBS about women in politics. And, it was actually the first time I met someone in politics who actually felt, wow, this is someone who I would love to represent me. I never thought about politicians that way. He was somebody who was, from the Midwest, like me, daughter of immigrants, mother of young children, someone who's really rooted in her community. And I'd never seen a politician like that before. And, sort of keeping that idea of Rashida and people like her, people like Grace Lee Boggs, organizers in communities that, I'm very familiar with. Fast forward to 2016, and our other producer, Jyoti Sarda, approached me about maybe doing something else about women in politics in the year we thought we would have a woman president. But that didn't happen. So, but keeping in mind, knowing that all of these movements, social movements, which have been, sort of built by women of color for the most part, and looking at, how are these women moving into electoral politics, it made sense to sort of, explore this in politics with a capital P and politics with a small p. And we knew this is a giant subject to tell an epic American political story through the lens of race and gender, that we would need like a team of other, of women of color filmmakers from the documentary world. And that's when I called Marge, because I knew I needed some help.
So Marge, how did you, identify what politicians you were going to follow and deploy those teams on the ground?
Sure. The only thing I'll add on to what Grace said is the other thing that was happening is that we are in this incredible moment of demographic shift in this country, right? Where the new American majority, as we reference in the trailer, is already the majority in many places around the country, and is at a tipping point everywhere else. So it was the intersection of these women running, but a community that is hungry to feel represented in their democracy and reflected. So we set out, we had some sort of core tenets that we wanted to stick to. It was important to us that we had all kinds of diversity, not just ethnic and racial, but also geographic diversity, young and old, people who, were running for small seats and large. because there's such commonality in their experience, regardless of where they fall in that kind of metric. And so because we wanted to tell the story of a movement, we wanted to make sure we had sort of a lot of different viewpoints into the movement. And then the other thing that the series really focuses on is organizers, because, you know, elections can't be won by candidates alone. And I think to some extent, many of us are kind of blind to the actual tremendous work that organizers do. Often or regularly, these Black women and women of color have been organizing in the service of white male candidates, so to see them in action, being able to organize in the service of people who represent their own communities and their own experiences, you know, that their stories felt just as profound as the candidates. So we wanted to find a way to tell a sort of an ecosystem story about this moment in time. So when we had all those metrics in place, we whittled down the list, and then it was the old who's going to let us follow them around with the camera bit. And that helped us make the final cut.
I mean, you really feel in the film that that your crews have gotten in deep with these candidates, including Stacey Abrams and Rashida Tlaib. You know, how much time were your crews spending in the field with those candidates?
I mean, it was a lot, right, Grace? I mean, you know, obviously it was sort of intermittent, but I think in all we shot, I don't know, maybe like 120, 150 days or something. So, you know, we shot a lot with an enormous territory to cover, and also this kind of craziness of a fixed timeline, an election timeline. I remember on election day, we had 52 people on crew across the country, which is, you know, pretty ambitious. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, listen, I think that all these women understand where we were coming from. They understand how incredibly powerful it is for women who look like them to see women like them in positions of sort of power and doing this work, because, you know, we don't get to see ourselves reflected often enough on screen. I just want to say I'm so grateful you asked Jihan about being a woman of color executive. Jihan is literally the only woman of color executive that we had the opportunity to pitch. She's a rare breed out there, and we definitely, you know, need more people who understand the value of these stories.
Not every candidate you follow wins, but a pretty high percentage of them do. And, you know, I wonder what your instincts were throughout the process. You know, had you kind of gamed out the candidates you were choosing because you thought that they had a good chance, or because they were more interesting stories because they might have been long shots, or, you know, how can you account for your success rate there?
Well, I would first say that we weren't making a campaign film. Like, it wasn't about the election, right? It's about a movement that continues beyond elections. And, you know, even though we shot in 2018 and 2019, the same themes are resonating right now with, you know, who is carrying the burden, which communities are, you know, suffering the most during COVID. The voter suppression that we see in Georgia in part 2 happened in Georgia 2 weeks ago, and in Kentucky like 2 days ago, right? You know, we weren't really interested in whether someone would win or lose. And even if they did lose, that tells us something about where we are in American politics today. But yeah.
I want to ask about the process of organizing all this material. Once you came back from 150 or so shoot days, and you've got all these stories, your editor, Julie Vitsa, is someone that I actually worked with in the 90s on the first project that I produced. So I was so glad.
You work with everyone, Tom.
Well, when you've been around for long enough, that happens. But can you talk about, you know, what it took to, you know, shape all these different stories into the cohesive 2-part project that it is?
Yeah, definitely couldn't have done it without the incredible talents of Julie Vitsa. You know, it's complicated. I mean, if we were going to stay really in each, very early in the project, we sort of thought about it more as portraits, you know, sort of individual stories, but it really is a movement. And so we kept coming back to this idea of continuing to center race and gender and the power of women of color, you know, so, and this idea of, you know, why they are successful. I mean, when you say what, you know, how do we account for our success rate? First of all, because, you know, when you get a bunch of brown girls together, they overachieve. That's what we do. So that's part of our success rate. But I think the other part of it is that the way that these women ran their campaigns was about going out into community, knocking on doors that people never go and knock on, reaching out to people who feel completely left out of an electoral process. And so we just wanted to keep bringing that theme back when we as we were cutting, because truly sort of the overarching question we're asking is what is this democracy that we're living in where close to 50% of people just don't bother to vote? You know, why? Why? Is it because they're lazy, or is it because there's nobody there who's really sort of speaking to their experiences and telling them you matter? So when we just kept those kind of core ideas and used that to help the process. But it was pretty painful, and we were cutting until the last possible available minute before POV were, you know, getting itchy scratchy on us.
What's it been like, you know, sharing the film now with people? Of course, you know, all filmmakers with projects coming out this spring, it's a little bit different than bringing a project out before ever has been. But, you know, I know that you've been doing some stuff online, and what have those experiences been like?
You know, it's interesting to release a film during a pandemic and during, you know, all the uprisings. On the one hand, we haven't been able, all of our outreach and impact has had to shift to digital. And that's I've never done that before. But on the other hand, it feels like, you know, there's captive audiences who are also hungry for this kind of this kind of programming, especially given what's happening in this country right now. It feels extremely topical. Yeah, I mean, you know, our broadcast is on Monday and Tuesday, and we're really excited to see, you know, who's going to turn out and, you know, how this will play out moving towards November, when people are thinking again, you know, feel like we had a little respite from COVID, but I think that's coming back again. So we'll see.
For other filmmakers who are watching, who will be bringing out films this year, having to use some of these digital tools, is there anything that you've learned along the way, you know, ups or downs in the process of connecting this way?
I mean, I think, you know, I think the online festival thing is a real Megillah for people still. You know, for us, these were easier decisions because we knew we had a release and a broadcast, you know, set. So it was just an opportunity for us to build buzz. I do think that's still a really complicated arena. And then on the impact side, I mean, we feel really blessed because our project is filled with organizers, and organizers know how to gather people.
That helps.
Right? And so, yeah, it does. And so we've really leaned into to that community because we know how, you know, how meaningful it is for them to actually be seen in a process that they're always part of but never seen in, you know. So that's been, you know, interesting. POV and PBS have sort of bent over backwards to help make it possible for us to do things that are a bit off path because they understand, you know, the moment. But these are long-term questions we have to grapple with, right, as an industry. How does this stuff change everything? And we have to learn a whole new set of things. The other thing I would say is just bring on people who are younger and cooler than us. Because there's a whole like digital tool set that we are like, we use with our elbows, but there are people who actually know how to use them properly.
Grace, we were talking about Detroit before, and you recently shared an email with people with connections to Detroit, talking about the specific situation of this film there. Can you share those details?
Well, it's actually not just Detroit. I mean, even though our broadcast is Monday and Tuesday, both Georgia Public Broadcasting and Detroit Public Television have opted not to air the film. So we are really trying to push everyone to the digital stream. You know, you can watch it on the PBS app. You can also go online at pov.org all of those links are on our website. But yeah, I mean, it makes it even, you know, it's ironic because it's public television, but you know, the people who need to see it on the public airways are not going to be able to access it unless they have a computer and strong internet.
The reasoning, as I understand it, of those stations is that because they're serving local audiences with politicians local to their region, that they feel it would be you know, a violation of equal time principles to do that. Is that fair to say?
I'm going to jump in. I think that's fair as a principle. However, and certainly in Detroit, maybe the situation was a little bit different because Rashida, you know, her re-election primary hasn't happened yet, and it's coming in early August. But in Georgia, it seems a little bit egregious. Georgia is a state of some 10.1 million people. And there is one congresswoman who is running for re-election in a district of 750,000, right? But what you see, like unequivocally in our project, is you see the machinery of voter suppression kind of open-handedly at play in Georgia. And that is, as Grace mentioned earlier, still very much openly in play, even perhaps more egregious than it was in 2018. And I think that, I actually think it's we're calling it an act of viewer suppression, because I think it is really problematic for a public television station to just eliminate that access across a state when what is being told is exactly how they are trying to stop you having your vote counted. So anyway, as I said, we've got a lot of organizers and we know how to make a lot of noise in other ways. So we're going to work our way around it. But I think we have to sort of ask some tough questions about these kinds of ideas, because literally our democracy is so fragile, particularly because of this moment and COVID. And, you know, like, it's everybody's responsibility to be fighting that fight if we say that we live in a democracy and we believe in the idea of democracy. So, yeah.
I mean, especially in Georgia, in your film, you really capture on the ground what was happening on election day, the way people were having their right to vote be denied through all kinds of different means. As we wrap this up, I want to ask, you know, what did you learn that can be applied to this year's elections?
I'll tell you what I learned. I only became an American in 2016, although, as you know, I've lived here many, many years. And I live in California, where we have a good, you know, relatively solid voting process. Literally, my jaw was on the ground with what we witnessed in Georgia. I mean, just outrageous acts of suppression that we weren't even necessarily hunting for suppression, because that wasn't really the heartbeat of the story that we were telling, but it just kept slapping us in the face, you know? So I really, it's what I said a second ago, our democracy is insanely fragile, and we live in this kind of comfort zone of thinking that it's all good because this is the United States and we are, you know, we are the standard bearers for democracy. But it is a much more sophisticated process now, the way that voter suppression happens, and it happens by 1,000 cuts in 1,000 ways. And if we all don't understand that and get involved in how to protect that precious right, then, you know, really the future of this country is really kind of perilous. So that's what I learned. Grace, what did you learn?
Yeah, the 1,000 cuts thing, it may not be just locking you out of the polling place, you know, like we saw so dramatically a couple days ago in Kentucky, but also just these smaller things like, you know, like not being able, or people, you'll see in the film, you know, the exact match laws where if you have a name that doesn't, you know, sort of confine with first name, you know, surname, first name, you know, if you're in the film, there's someone who's Vietnamese, she has 4 different syllables in her name. If it doesn't exactly match, you're not going to be able to vote, or you might get purged from the voter rolls. And even just, you know, this fragile democracy that we talk about, like this idea that public television stations are, you know, not showing this film, you know, to the audiences that actually need it the most is problematic, right?
So last question that just came in from the audience. This may be a hard one to pick from, but someone's asking, which organizer impressed you the most in, throughout this process?
It is a hard question to answer because they're all kind of amazing. But Nsé Ufot, who is the executive director of the New Georgia Project, is a force of nature. We're so excited that the rest of America is about to really like meet Nsé and get to know her. And I think others like Latasha Brown, who runs Black Voters Matter Fund. There's just incredible, tireless women who they just don't quit. And however much they are beaten down, they just get back up and come back with twice as many people behind them. So I really hope people see and then find the organizers where they live, their political home that they can connect to, because it's much easier to kind of get in this fight to protect our democracy when you're doing it with your tribe.
And I would just add the folks in Georgia from Mi Gente. There's a whole slew of people who are undocumented but have lived in this country for many years, and they can't vote, but they are able to still participate in the process. And many of them, you know, are out there, you know, knocking on doors, making sure that their interests and their voices are heard, because, you know, policy affects them as well. So I was really moved by them too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Grace and Marge, thank you very much for this film. I look forward to audiences getting to see it starting Monday night on POV, and look forward to people reacting to it. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Tom.
All right, we'll say goodbye to Grace and Marge, and then our final guest is David France. He has a career dating back decades as a journalist. He turned to filmmaking with his project about AIDS activism called How to Survive a Plague, that was nominated for an Oscar. His new film is called Welcome to Chechnya, and let's watch the trailer for that. It's coming to HBO next week.
Скажи, пожалуйста, насколько критична ситуация?
Дело в том, что мой дядя узнал про мою ориентацию вот недавно. Он в любом случае меня убьет.
Аня, привет. Мы начали получать первые сообщения из Чечни о том, что в Чечне происходят массовые задержания геев.
Мы можем поехать в Лово, поедем с нами в Чукат, доедем до какой-нибудь там станции, как я ушел с метро, передокрылись, и больше в России не было.
I wanted to ask you about the alleged abduction and torture of gay men in the Republic.
Это ерунда. У нас таких людей нету.
И практически сразу было решение принято о том, чтобы людей спасать, эвакуировать.
У нас не было такого опыта. Нужно же людей скрывать, нужно их искать им визы, какие-то пути тайные, вывоза из страны.
Искать, я прекрасно все знаю.
Я не буду делать все, чтобы это никогда не всплыло. Изменить ситуацию может только человек, который прошел эти пытки и заявит об этом публично.
Я буду делать всевозможные действия, чтобы заткнуть меня.
I'll bring on David France now. Hey, David, welcome.
Hey, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So I understand you first heard about this story reading an article in the New Yorker by Masha Gessen. Where did you go from there, having gotten this, idea planted in your head?
I called Masha, who I've known as a fellow journalist all these years, and I said, I had no idea this was happening. Why is nobody covering this? Why is it only your story and nothing following up on it? And she was very encouraging of me moving forward to document what activists were having to do and forced to do, because there's no government agency that was coming to the defense of the people in Chechnya. And they just formed this kind of radical activism of the kind I'd never seen before. So she made the introductions, and I was in Moscow within, I think, 2 weeks.
Well, for outsiders, can you kind of clarify the distinction between Chechnya and Russia and the plight of LGBTQ people in those two different regions?
Absolutely. Chechnya is a republic of the Russian Federation. It's like a state. It's in practice given some degree of autonomy. It is got 1.4 million people. They constitute an ethnic minority. They have their own language. So they have kept quite distinct from the rest of Russia, but they're governed by the same laws as the rest of Russia. And in practice, however, the Kremlin has not enforced Russian laws there. The leader of Chechnya was handpicked by Putin and put in place by Putin. He stands for elections every year, but they're not. They're notoriously, opaque, those elections, and he works kind of hand in glove. Certainly sits at Putin's pleasure, and works hand in glove with Putin on issues of interest to Putin, and that's and Putin allows him to do these other things that consume him. And this is certainly not the first time he's been accused of brutality and extrajudicial murder, but it is the first time that he's, or anybody in the world, has been revealed to be leading a government-controlled, top-down, systemic campaign to round up every LGBT person in the area for liquidation. I mean, this is not since Hitler have we seen anything like this, and the world has just not stood up to give it the kind of noise and demand for justice that it deserves.
So you and your film crews go into some really hairy situations in this film. I mean, can you give an example of, a time when you were kind of most concerned about your own safety or the safety of your crew?
I think the first time that I realized that the risks were real was when we were filming one evening in the main shelter, and we got information from the organizational headquarters that they believed that the shelter would be raided that night by Chechen authorities. They had reason to believe that the location had been revealed somehow and that people were coming. And I sat there with my local producer, Oskar Kurov, who was also the camera operator. And we just waited for them. And it was one of the hairiest evenings I think I've spent. And luckily nobody came. We did feel that our presence there as journalists and documentary filmmakers may have been beneficial if they had come, but we really didn't know.
And that scene, if I recall correctly, it comes through in the film. Am I right?
Well, that scene is talked about.
Yeah.
A little bit even on.
You're not on camera, but we.
Right, exactly. And then there were many other instances where we thought somebody's coming and somebody was believed to be coming, or somebody called and said they were coming, so we always felt the breath of these murderers on our necks.
I see someone asking in the chat room about where they'll be able to see this on HBO. To clarify, this is going to be on regular HBO, not just HBO Max. Am I right about that? Yes. So anyone who has some version of HBO will be able to see the film.
And I might add that for a period of 30 days, they will have the film in front of the paywall so that anybody can see it on HBO.com starting on July 9th.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. So a really interesting thing that you did in this film is you had an understandable need to protect people's identities. Maybe you can talk through the different things that you considered and what you arrived at.
Well, Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, what everybody who's in the film knew way before I did is that they are actually literally being hunted across the globe as part of this blood cleansing campaign. So they could not reveal their faces even once they made it to places of relative.
So let's just pause on that for a second. So even someone who escapes to exile to Canada or Scandinavia, that's not a reason to necessarily think they're safe.
Correct. There's twofold reasons for this. Well, the first is that this literally is like an incredibly mad idea that it would be possible to somehow eradicate queers from Chechen life. It's absurd. But it's one that the government has invested now in the families of the people. And they've done it by use of their security forces. So if somebody is believed to be alive anywhere in the world, their families are coming under intense security force pressure to get them back and carry out what the Kadyrov now instructs them to do, is these so-called honor killings. He is singularly focused on the elimination of these people, and so that's they are never going to feel comfortable coming out of the shadows, unfortunately, because this will follow them their whole lives.
So to return to your need to protect them, even if they had escaped into exile somewhere, how did you take us through the process of how you thought about that as a filmmaker? Well,
I asked them if they would let me film them. So that was the first really big step, knowing how dangerous it was for them that they entrusted me with this footage. Right? And I safeguarded it very closely. I made sure it was multiply encrypted. We set up an edit studio that was air gapped. It had no internet connectivity, and we never moved footage across the internet. So we were really careful about that. And then when I got the footage home, I looked at all the tools that documentary filmmakers have experimented with. Some really ingenious, some beautiful, and none of them seemed to work for what I needed in this film. What I needed in this film was for you to read the emotional journey on the faces of the people in the film.
I remember you described to me that you at one point thought about animating people, but the problem was that even if you animated someone, their face would look close enough that they could still be hunted down.
Yeah, because I promised everybody there in the field, I said, I'm going to use this rotoscoping technique where I'll clip you out of the frame, I'll put you through a kind of a cartooning filter and throw you back in the frame and see if people can follow that way. Every one of those filters made them more like themselves. They were kind of caricatures, of themselves. It emphasized, the uniqueness of each part of their features. If they had like a crooked ear, it became a really crooked ear. So it was like really underscoring who they were. And I knew it wouldn't work. I didn't even show it to them because I promised everybody that I would show them the approach that I wanted to take. And it was frustrating for a long time. This was a process of research and development that took a number of months before we spoke to somebody who thought that they could do this artificial intelligence technique, which we actually did use in the film, which would allow the VFX supervisor to film somebody else's face and then reduce it digitally to an algorithm that then tracks over the face of the person in the film and maps the new skin over the old skin.
One example of a similar technology that people will be familiar with is in Martin Scorsese's film, The Irishman, where they were using a similar technique to map old Robert De Niro with a younger Robert De Niro's face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So you were doing the same thing, except using putting a different person's face on.
Yeah, exactly. And we were doing it for, a feature-length film with 22 faces needing covered. So like the undertaking was intense. When they did that for The Irishman, there's a lot of hand work in that. I mean, there were big teams of people who were making sure that those images were stitched together in that flawless way. And what we built was an algorithm that does that on its own through deep machine learning. This tool, when trained properly on the face in the film that needs covering, does the mapping automatically. So that's what makes it, I think, a functional tool for documentary filmmakers who don't have Scorsese's budget.
Yeah.
And I think what it in effect does is to deliver a new tool to documentary filmmakers for approaching this problem. And you talked about the other faces. Yeah, I recruited faces of activists and asked them if they would use their own face as a shield to protect these folks. And it was really kind of a direct action that they took in allowing me to digitize them in this way. And I know that they feel like they've really, and rightly so, feel like they've really done an immense, given an immense contribution to the lives of the people in the film.
They truly have, in being able to tell that story. There's a question that came through asking about when you were going into Russia, were you there as a journalist or some other means?
I applied for a tourist visa because my counsel and advisor at the beginning of this told me that I was not, that most business visas are denied. So if I had applied as an independent filmmaker, it would almost automatically be denied. So the only way to shoot this film was to go as a tourist and do it on my vacation.
As I wrap this up, I want to ask, the film premiered at Sundance. It's played at the Berlin Film Festival. So you were one of the lucky filmmakers this year to actually have had some experiences with a live audience. But since the film, has started to be out in circulation, what kind of positive or negative reactions have you gotten?
Well, certainly it was, we were immensely lucky to have a number of film festivals before that world was so, hammered as the rest of us were. And to feel your film in front of an audience is one of the most powerful experiences. And you work, we especially were working in secrecy on this film until we could cover the faces, which we only completed sometime it was even early January, I think, before Sundance. So then to bring it out and to show it in that kind of, in those powerful rooms at Sundance and in Berlin was to really feel the way that audiences responded to the characters exactly the way I hoped that they would, exactly the way I did, which is to see them as, heroes, modern day heroes. And I'm not using, I never use that word lightly. Like, these people are doing things that almost nobody else would do, and at great risk to themselves. And they were with me at those film festivals, and the audiences really rewarded them with their admiration and thanks. So that was really powerful.
And has there been any signs that the government of Chechnya has taken note or responded in any way to the film?
Not that we've seen yet. We hear things from the ground, but we're also have a campaign that an influence campaign attached to the film, where we're showing the film to embassies in Moscow and St. Petersburg. We're showing the film to European parliamentary gatherings, UK parliamentary gatherings, to the Parliament in Canada. Canada's been so central in responding to all of this, and at the UN and elsewhere, to try and bring this subject back to prominence where it deserves to be. We know that the lockdown in Chechnya has been one of the most severe in the world, and it's allowed campaigns like this, and we know that this campaign has continued, to go without any oversight from anybody else anywhere in the world. And we're hoping that the film helps bring that outcry.
Let me squeeze in one more question, because the film really calls attention to the power of asylum cases and the ability for someone to escape near certain death by persecution into another country where they're going to be safer. I wonder what what added insight it gave you about the act of seeking political asylum, and particularly our own country in the U.S. Way of handling these cases.
Well, there's a line in the film where David Steve, who's one of the activists, he says, what they might have come from wealth, they might have come from good families, they might have been working in business, they might have been working in healthcare, but who are they now? Now they are refugees, and everything gets reduced to that. And I followed so many more stories than are in the film as people moved into their destination countries and grappled with the new language and the new culture and the realization that's devastating, that they have been sent into a secret life that will last them forever. And as they adjust to that, it's just been remarkable. It is harder for LGBTQ people who are fleeing persecution to get the attention of governments and the help of governments. And in this instance, despite many applications, the US has not received any one of the people fleeing this campaign in Chechnya. So I know that this administration has shut down those doors for just about everybody. So it's not a particular case here, but when Canada stepped up and opened its doors to those fleeing Kadyrov's reign, the US did nothing. And that's disturbing, and something I think we should all think about in November.
David, thank you very much for this film. It'll be on HBO on June 30th, and then in front of their paywall as of July 9th, did you say?
I think it's July 9th for a month, yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Tom.
All right, before I wrap up, let me just share a couple things we've got coming up. On July 8th, Doc NYC is going to continue its online educational programs. We'll have 3 sessions all packed into July 8th about documentary funding, with representatives from the Ford Foundation, Impact Partners, Chicago Media Project, CineReach, and others. You can watch the panels live that day from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., or you can watch our recording anytime later. There will also be a breakout room to connect with the documentary community. You can roll for this day at docnyc.net. I am pleased that our Friday Fix archives are now available on YouTube for free. You can watch what we've been doing the last 9 weeks or more. And just go to the Doc NYC Fest page on YouTube. I want to remind you to start your week with Monday Memo. It's our weekly newsletter that brings you the latest documentary news straight to your inbox. You can sign up for free at docnyc.net. And coming up later today, as every Friday, is Firelight Media's Beyond Resilience show. It starts at 4, but you've got to RSVP by 3:30. We'll try to put the link in our chat window there. This week, Sonia Childress is going to lead a discussion about documentary impact campaigns during isolation, something we heard Grace and Marge talking about a little bit. She'll be talking to the teams behind Coded Bias and Crip Camp and others. So do check that out. It's been a great series. And then we're going to take a week off next week, but we will be back on July 10th with some terrific guests. Dawn Porter will discuss her new film, John Lewis, Good Trouble, about the civil rights crusader. That film is being released next week from Magnolia Pictures, so look out for John Lewis. Sam Feder will talk about his new documentary, Disclosure, on transgender representation in film and television. That film is now playing on Netflix. And Judith Helfand will discuss her film, Cooked, Survival by Zip Code, examining how poor communities are disproportionately affected by climate change. That film premiered at Doc NYC. We'll put a link in the chat so you can sign up for free to be a part of our show on July 10th, 2 weeks from now. I want to thank our guests, Jihan Robinson, Grace Lee, Marjan Safinia, and David France. Please check out Quibi for Blackballed and their other doc series. Look out for And She Could Be Next on POV next week, and Welcome to Chechnya on HBO next week. I want to thank Asha Phelps of the IFC Center for her support of Friday Fix, and to the Doc NYC team of Dor Dotson, Sarah Moto, Caitlin Boyle, and Rafaela Neyhausen. Hope you have a great weekend. I will see you back here in 2 weeks.